You're listening to The Globalist, first broadcast on the 31st of March 2025 on Monocle Radio. The Globalist, in association with UBS. Live from London, this is The Globalist with me, Emma Nelson. A very warm welcome to today's programme. Coming up.
If you're not thinking like them, they're just going to lock you up. And we're here for that. We're here to protest that. We have our rights.
We'll be in Istanbul as protests against the arrest of President Erdogan's main rival continue, and around 100 journalists are arrested as they try to get into the country to report on events. Also coming up, hopes that last week's earthquake in Myanmar will prompt a pause in the country's civil war are dashed as the junta steps up its bombing of rebel targets. Plus,
we are excited to announce we will build a new national aquatic centre with a games capacity of 25,000 people. And I confirm it will be the best aquatic centre in the globe.
We'll be in Australia, where Brisbane's trying to overcome negative headlines about its plans for the Olympic Games. Plus the papers and why we might have been getting it all wrong all along about what constitutes a glass of champagne. That's all coming up right here on The Globalist, live from London. First, a look at what else is happening in today's news. Donald Trump has reportedly threatened to impose secondary tariffs on Russian oil exports if peace is not reached in Ukraine, and he deems it to be Moscow's fault. The French far-right leader Marine Le Pen is due in court today as it rules whether she's guilty of embezzlement. If convicted, she could be barred from the 2027 presidential race. And the first attempt to launch a rocket carrying satellites into space from continental Europe has failed. Stay tuned to Monocle Radio throughout the day for more on these stories. But first, the Turkish authorities have continued their crackdown this weekend, reportedly detaining around 100 journalists as they arrive in the country. They were there to cover the continued protests against the arrest of President Erdogan's main political rival, Ekrem İmamoğlu. Well, to tell us more, I'm joined now by Ayla Jean Yakli, who's based just outside Istanbul for us this morning. A very good morning to you, Ayla.
Good morning.
You've been down to the protests in the last couple of days. Just bring us up to date as to where we are with them, please.
Mm-hmm. So after about a week of protests that were staged outside of City Hall by the main opposition party, the chairman of that party moved the gathering to a space on the Asian side of the city. It's an area that's designated for political meetings. And this was a shift, from a more spontaneous call for action on the streets to a more organized political rally. And that happened on Saturday. But according to the party, more than 2 million people attended it. And they were there to express their anger, not only over the jailing of Istanbul Mayor Ekrem İmamoğlu, but also what they see as a dangerous slide into authoritarianism in Turkey. So
there is absolutely no sign that these protests are calming down. In fact, if anything, they're getting more powerful.
Well, they're changing. I think that's important to note. They aren't going away, that's for certain. But it takes a lot of energy to get out every night and protest, and especially if you run the risk of clashing with police. So I think that what the CHP, the main opposition party, is trying to do now is harness this anger and sense of, this willingness to go out onto the street into something that it can translate into either pressure on the government. A couple of things that they're doing. One is they've called for a boycott of companies that are close to the government. And the second thing that they're doing now as well is they're gathering signatures. They want to come up with a petition of the millions to demand that Erdogan hold early elections.
Tell us a little bit more about just how divided Istanbul and the rest of Turkey feels at the moment, because we often underestimate the support given to President Erdogan. And one wonders now just how loud their voices are.
That's a very good point. Erdogan is one of Turkey's most popular politicians. He's its longest serving leader. He has a very loyal base of supporters. And if we look at his last election, which was just in 2023, he won with more than 50% of the vote. And those voters do remain largely dedicated to him. But it is important to note that his support has been diminishing since the last election in 2023, because mainly his handling of a long-running cost of living crisis. Turkey is now dealing with inflation of about 40%. That's down from 85% about a year and a half ago, and this has impoverished millions of people. So Erdogan has seen his support slipping. Your point about this being a divided society is true. Like a lot of places, Turkey's quite polarized. Here, the lines run quite deep. There's, Erdogan has a base from conservatives, nationalists, whereas the opposition party draws most of its support from the secular center left, but they're also nationalists. The Kurds are an important bloc in Turkey, and they're sort of being left out of this struggle between the main opposition and the government. So those lines still remain very much drawn.
Where are we hearing a voice from the opposition now? Because we have Ekrem İmamoğlu effectively silenced because he's in prison. But do we have any idea of what he is saying, or whether he is gathering or galvanizing his supporters?
He's still issuing messages. They broadcast a message from him, that he'd written at this massive rally on Saturday. Through his lawyers, he's posting on Twitter. He's trying to remain present, I think, in people's minds, and that's a really important way of doing it. We don't know how long he will be behind bars before his trial even begins. There isn't even an indictment against him yet, so this could be a very long process. And there are precedents from other popular politicians who've been locked away, namely Selahattin Demirtas, a Kurdish politician, that remaining present through social media, through messages delivered through your party, is essential if you're going to keep that public support.
And indeed, how easy is it to report on what is happening at the moment? We have seen over the weekend the arrest of 100 journalists at least. At the end of last week, the high-profile BBC journalist Mark Lowen was deported for not having the right accreditation. I mean, is that having any kind of a chilling effect on the way that people can actually tell this story?
That seems to be the intent of it. Whether it does impact journalists like myself in that way remains to be seen. But it's a risk, and it's, like I said, the intent. And it's really concerning. Mark Lowen was deported. We don't know if the accreditation was an issue, and we don't even know if that's actually a legal requirement. That's what the government has claimed. The BBC, when I reached out, didn't respond, but it's not even clear that that's actually a mandatory requirement. It may have well been used as an excuse to get rid of a very prominent journalist who's done an excellent job, not only of covering the protests, but over the years covering Turkey. More than a dozen Turkish journalists, including an AFP photographer, was arrested, and the government made a sort of big show of the fact that they were released from custody after being jailed, but they still face criminal trials for covering the protests on accusations of that they somehow participated in the violence by covering it. And as you said, there's been more detentions of journalists. All of this, the fact that journalists are being targeted, sends a very clear message that this is a movement, an event that Erdogan's government is not happy with the way that it's being covered, and it's a means of silencing this kind of coverage. And
tell us a little bit more about the speech given by President Erdogan this weekend. Because you had Eid it's Bayram, isn't it, in Turkey at the moment? You have a 9-day holiday, starting officially yesterday, but it sort of thing got going from Saturday onwards. And there was quite an explosive speech delivered by President Erdogan, effectively targeting Israel. I mean, there is a sense therefore, that perhaps that Erdogan is feeling absolutely emboldened by what is happening at home?
Well, he's been one of the most outspoken critics of Israel, even before the war started in Gaza. And I think that that's something that he has a lot of public support from in Turkey. People here very much disagree with Israel's handling of the conflict in Gaza after October 7th. So it might also be an attempt to position himself as, I'm sending a message on sort of the geopolitics above and beyond what's happening on the streets of Turkey is another way of looking at it. But I think that you're absolutely right in making that point that the response that we've seen to date from Turkey's traditional allies in Europe or in the U.S. have given Erdogan no reason to pause in this crackdown. Has made it by no means has made him second guess his decision to arrest his number one rival in a future election. He spoke with President Trump just a couple of days before Imamoglu's arrest, and we don't know what they discussed on that call, obviously, but whatever was said, and it probably had nothing to do with Imamoglu's arrest, it certainly gave Erdogan a sense that he's got enough U.S. support to do something this drastic.
And apart from the United States, do we have any strong reaction coming from the international community? Because, yes, Turkey has a finger in a lot of pies and has influence absolutely everywhere. But what appears to be happening from the outside, especially when it comes to the lack of reporting and the lack of the ability to report what is happening and the detention of a main political opposition, suggests that there is a strong erosion of democracy taking place in Turkey.
We've seen concerns expressed by the European Union. We've seen concerns expressed by governments in Europe, but there hasn't been much beyond that. And there might not be that many tools to sort of express the concern any more forcefully. But I think there's also, as you point out, a really important role that Turkey is positioned to play in its relationship with Europe vis-a-vis Ukraine. As the U.S. steps back on Ukraine, or at least has created a lot of uncertainty about its future support, Turkey, which has NATO's second biggest army, has a very sophisticated and well-developed defense industry, is a country that Europe can't ignore if it's going to develop its own sort of security architecture without the U.S. So it also, it's important to note, has a potential mediating role in an end to this conflict. It's had good relations with both Kiev and with Moscow throughout the conflict. So I think that Europe is also wary of alienating Turkey at a time when it's hoping that it can rely on it more closely.
Ayla-Jean Yakli in Istanbul, thank you so much for joining us on The Globalist on Monocle Radio. 13:13 in Jakarta, 7:13 a.m. here in London. Well, last week's devastating earthquake in Myanmar led to hopes that there would be a pause in the civil war. It became very clear, however, very quickly that this was not going to be the case, because the junta pressed on with airstrikes against rebel groups, even as the UN and neighbouring countries called for a ceasefire to allow humanitarian aid to get through. Well, joining me now for more is Monocle's Asia editor in Bangkok, James Chambers, and Dr. Ronan Lee, academic and author of Myanmar's Rohingya Genocide, Identity, History and Hate Speech. A very good morning to you both. Good afternoon to you, James.
Hi, Emma. Good morning.
Ronan, if we could begin with you, there is immediate fear, hasn't there been, from the moment that the Myanmar authorities called for help, that no one would know whether that help would ever reach the intended targets?
Well, much of the help won't reach the intended targets. If the help is funneled through the military dictatorship, it will be used by the military dictatorship to try and keep themselves in power. This is not a group of people whose desire is to help ordinary people. This is people who see, I think, with this earthquake disaster, they see an opportunity to embed themselves in power, and they'll use this situation, I think, to continue to do that. They've demonstrated a willingness to in fact use airstrikes. At a time when you would imagine that humanitarian response would be a complete no-brainer, but the junta is intending to see this as an opportunity. It's what they've done for the last 4 years. They have shown absolutely no interest in the welfare of ordinary people in Myanmar. It's been a dreadful 4 years for ordinary people in Myanmar, and this earthquake and the response to it's making things much, much worse.
Staying with you, Ronan, for the moment, the epicenter of this earthquake, as far as we understand, was actually in the region which is a stronghold for the resistance forces, which makes it doubly problematic, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's really concerning, and I think this is why we'll see in the coming days the statistics on the initial deaths and numbers of people who are injured and missing will rise considerably, because what we've had so far are figures coming from the military junta. They have no interest in helping. One of the big complaints that's been made, obviously by ordinary people on the ground, is that there's no military assistance coming to help. People are digging out, looking for missing people digging with their bare hands, while any soldiers in the region are nowhere to be seen. They're not assisting. So troops aren't been a part of the humanitarian response because of the ongoing civil war. Of course, there's a shortage of heavy machinery. Electricity has been cut. It's very, very hot. I think it's something that will be an issue in the coming days and weeks. So this is a country where even before the earthquake, there were over 3 million displaced people, half the population living in poverty. Now they've got an issue to deal with where it's hot. They don't have electricity, so there'll be issues of food spoilage and things like that in the coming days and weeks, and issues of access to even keeping medicines cold so that they're of use will be a considerable issue. This is dreadful for ordinary people in an area where the resistance have made significant gains in the last 12 months.
Let's get the overview from Thailand now, which also felt this earthquake, didn't it, James? I mean, it was 800 kilometres away, and it still managed to destroy a building under construction in Bangkok. I mean, how is Thailand viewing what's happening with the neighbours?
Yes, that's right, Emma. It's a bit of a tale of two cities. I mean, the devastation has mostly been in Myanmar, but weirdly, Bangkok did feel a lot of tremors, and that 7.7 magnitude earthquake that hit about 72 hours ago, right now, did shake the city. But if you compare the devastation, there's been at least 1,700 confirmed dead in Myanmar, and that number is expected to rise probably quite dramatically. Whereas here in Bangkok, there have been 18 fatalities so far. And as you mentioned, most of them have been in that building that collapsed. It was a 30-story government building, the State Audit Office, which was under construction. And 76 workers are still missing. So I'm sure the fatalities are going to rise here, but it'll be nowhere near the numbers we're seeing in Myanmar. But life continued over the weekend, but people were, staying close to the ground and in the open air, going to the parks. And the big thing today has been the return to work. The thing that separates Bangkok and Mandalay is there's a lot of high-rise buildings here, and those are the ones that really felt it the most. So you have a lot of office workers who are very nervous and very anxious about going back to work. And this morning there was a lot of evacuations because any loud bang would set off rumours, and you'd have all these office workers fleeing their buildings. Even the one that I live next to, it's a revenue department building. This morning when we were having breakfast, we could see all the office workers pouring out of the streets and then looking up at the tall building, and you suddenly look and see if it's leaning. But it's all anxiety. So far nothing has happened. There's been no other buildings collapse, but people are very, very nervous, especially anyone who works in a tall building.
Returning to you, Ronan, and the reaction from the international community, we have a very new situation insofar as USAID is no longer playing the role that it perhaps could have done in the past. So now other international players are stepping in, including China. I mean, what difference does this make?
Well, it makes a big difference on the ground. I mean, the United States provided until until the Trump administration arrived, the United States was providing about 1/3 of Myanmar's foreign aid. It was the major player within Myanmar. That's really gone now. China, in the response to the earthquake, is the big player on the ground. China's donated. Made an announcement of donating a sum of money that dwarfs the money that the Trump administration's put forward. So the Trump administration has offered, I think, $2 million in humanitarian response to the earthquake. As an illustration of the withdrawal of the United States from the region and from Myanmar, that's about 1/3 of what a country like Ireland has presented. Or has committed. So this is playing out on the ground. The United States would traditionally have been one of the first movers when it came to disaster response in the region. They had they used warehouses in the Middle East, and in Malaysia, which were fully stocked and prepared to deal with disaster events. It remains to be seen how readily the United States can now access those facilities, because the staff have been laid off. The USAID staff, who would ordinarily do disaster response in Southeast Asia, they're not there to do that. There are still some staff. But the significant US response that you would have expected just isn't there. How that's going to work in terms of other groups, the response from other countries who are accustomed to taking the lead from the United States in situations like this, well, that remains to be seen. But what we're seeing on the ground is that we're seeing China being the major player. And this I think geopolitically, this sends a really strong message about what we should expect in the coming years. We should expect that China will be the major regional player in Myanmar, and that the United States under President Trump are comfortable with Myanmar being a client state of China, and that's not something that's seemingly going to cause very much concern in the Oval Office.
Dr. Roland Lee and James Chambers, thank you both for joining us on Monocle Radio. Still to come on today's programme. Why America is taking on France in the production of champagne. Stay with us on The Globalist.
UBS is a global financial services firm with over 150 years of heritage. Built on the unique dedication of our people, we bring fresh thinking and perspective to our work. We know that it takes a marriage of intelligence and heart to create lasting value for our clients. It's about having the right ideas, of course, but also about having one of the most accomplished systems and an unrivaled network of global experts. That's why at UBS, we pride ourselves on thinking smarter to make a real difference. Tune in to The Bulletin with UBS every week for the latest insights and opinions from UBS all around the world.
We're going to have a quick look at the newspapers now. Joining me to do the heavy lifting is Steve Crawshaw, author, journalist and former Human Rights Watch UK director, in the studio for this Monday morning's review. Good morning, Steve.
Good morning.
I need to ask you how you've just released a book, and ladies and gentlemen, he's smiling from ear to ear. Things are going well.
It's the relief that things are. You wrestle over things. So as we've, I think, discussed a bit before, war crimes and justice is about prosecuting the powerful. War crimes and the battle for justice, and sadly it's more and more relevant. Actually, we'll talk a little bit about it in a moment, and some off to Syria for doing some updates on that, but coming out and it's out there. It's out there.
Off we go. Right, here we go. Let's have a look at the papers today. And one of those traits that people who like to display dictatorial features is to ensure that they stay in power longer than the rules allow. This morning, on the last 12 hours, we have already had Donald Trump saying that he has been presented with a credible plan that could allow him to seek a third term as President of the United States, something which he is not allowed to do.
It is quite extraordinary. In fact, there was too many stories of Trump, various bits of madness to choose from. That was just in one day from Sunday. But as you say, it's kind of interesting. So this began with an NBC interview yesterday, which everybody is reporting on. So all of the headlines are the same about really what. The NBC's own report on it has a nice little kind of in commas bit between Trump didn't rule out the possibility, quote, which is prohibited by the Constitution under the 22nd Amendment. So you have to throw these things in, and he still says it's absolutely possible. His good friend, of course, Vladimir Putin, who he currently claims that he's feeling cross or quote unquote pissed off with.
You've already said he's his good friend.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think
we're moving closer along those lines.
I think I would certainly see it that way, and I think many would. I say, as of today, he's just saying he's annoyed with him or, quote, pissed off with him. But in practice, he at the same time says what a good relationship they have. And I think Zelensky of Ukraine certainly sees it that way. So again and again, we're having to see these extraordinary statements made by newspapers and others reporting on these and broadcasters that you have to tuck in the fact either this is not true what someone's saying or which is prohibited. So he can indeed look to the fact that Putin also, of course, was only supposed to do 2 terms. He had various creative bits of ways. And finally, Putin actually changed the constitution. It's an extraordinary place that we have got to. And the fact that we are able or forced to discuss this in such a calm tone of voice, I think is one of the most extraordinary things that we're confronting.
Indeed, that it's not the absolute headline news and everybody's dropping what they're doing to actually really contemplate the fact that this is the president of America.
Yeah. And we continue to do, to some extent, what was happening with his first term of like, oh, he can't really be serious, can he? And all of us, I think, all of the commentators and everyone around the world thought he can't be serious about the various things he suggested he might do. And then actually it was often quite worse than he was. So we do definitely have to take it seriously. NBC put one of the possibilities of how he might be able to do it would be that Vance would take it and then would step aside. But he said, oh, I've got some other ideas up my sleeve, which he refused to reveal. So it's kind of incredible. I think it's a great challenge for media reporting of how to state in clear terms how bad certain suggestions are, because quite rightly, serious independent media feel the natural responsibility to put, quote unquote, both sides. But it's very, very difficult when you get someone who's ready to do these kind of things.
Let's move on to a story from Haaretz, which is Benjamin Netanyahu is heading to Europe. He's heading to Hungary, and it's his first trip since the ICC issued an arrest warrant. So we have lots of complicated issues here, don't we? Travelling Netanyahu, the warmth of a welcome in Hungary, and the, dare I say it, impotence of the ICC.
Yes, perhaps the impotence, that's kind of, you're quite right to flag it potentially like that, and they're certainly feeling very worried. So this is a kind of toe in the water of being dipped, if you like, really. The fact that a European country, obviously Viktor Orban in Hungary is, off the scale in his own ways, and he will get the warm welcome. That, let us not forget, Netanyahu already received in the United States, both during the Biden administration from Congress and then from Trump, but they're not a member of the court, whereas Hungary is. I think this is really interesting. It'll get some headlines when he arrives later this week, I'm sure, obviously. But really the question is, what's the rest of Europe going to do about the fact you've got a request that is there for, an issued international arrest warrant, and yet European governments themselves are quite wary of doing what they are required to do. So Paris has said, oh, we're not quite sure about this. Berlin has said, we're not quite sure. Even The Hague, the city of peace and justice. And I was interested by another Haaretz piece, great Israeli newspaper from earlier, but which they linked to this news story, whose headline says, Arresting Netanyahu, Why the ICC Doesn't Trust Israel's Justice System to Investigate Gaza War Crimes. And this is really the bottom line of it, that you get Western governments and commentators sometimes saying, oh, but they're a democracy. They've got a legal system. Now, it is, of course, an electoral democracy, and they do, of course, have a legal system which in many contexts is working properly. But on this, as Haaretz makes very, very clear, actually there's no investigations at all. And I think that needs to be confronted, where Donald Trump is trying so hard to either damage or to destroy the court, including by sanctions he's introduced. I think it's going to be really important for European governments to, step up to the plate on this one.
Finally, if you're seeking solace or all this is getting too much for you, doctors are now telling you to take a spin around an art gallery.
I love this story. So The Guardian actually has two different headlines. Online, the headline is "Take two Van Goghs daily," and the print version has "Spot of Monet, just what the doctor ordered." So this is something that started in Montreal, especially a few years ago, and it's a really interesting mental health one. Obviously, the pandemic, as we all know, created a huge spike in mental health issues, which are always so bad in any case. And what this does is, on those intractable issues where a doctor doesn't really have anything, who comes into their surgery and says, I'm feeling this and this and that. And so the idea is you literally get a free pass to go to the art gallery. So in Montreal was where it started, but it's been done elsewhere now as well. So you get a free pass to go around, and they've measured this, that they claim that you can actually see that people, simply by being inspired by other things. And also loneliness, they're now doing those as group, not just you wandering alone around a gallery, but going with groups around. It may be overstated what it's saying, but I think it's a lovely idea of going for those very, very simple things which can make sometimes such a huge difference.
Steve Crawshaw, what better advice could we hear? Thank you so much for joining me on the programme. The time here in London is 7:31 a.m. You're listening to The Globalist with me, Emma Nelson. A quick look now at what else we're keeping an eye on today. Donald Trump has reportedly said he's very angry with Russia's President Putin after he questioned the credibility of Ukraine's President Zelensky. Mr. Trump threatened to impose secondary tariffs on Russian oil export if peace was not reached in Ukraine, and he deemed it to be Moscow's fault. Meanwhile, there are reports that Donald Trump has also said he doesn't rule out seeking a third term in office, but he added it was too early to think about doing so. Mr. Trump said he'd been presented with plans that would allow him to stay in power. The French far-right leader Marine Le Pen is due in court today as it rules whether she's guilty of embezzlement. If convicted, she could be barred from the 2027 presidential race. Her party has called the trial a witch hunt. And the first attempt to launch a rocket carrying satellites into space from continental Europe has failed. The uncrewed Spectrum rocket fell to the ground and exploded 40 seconds into its flight from a Norwegian spaceport. This is The Globalist. Stay tuned. 16:32 in Brisbane, which is where we head now. Because rowing in crocodile-infested rivers, a new but small stadium that few want and no one can afford, and supercharged property prices. Brisbane's efforts to unveil a dynamic and thrilling plan for the 2032 Olympics are already being battered by negative headlines. So how does it save itself? Well, to tell us more, I'm joined now by Paul Osborne, at late of the Monocle Radio parish here in London, who's now actually decamped to Brisbane to live there permanently. A very good afternoon to you, Paul. One does wonder, did you actually abandon London for a better new Olympian life in Brisbane?
Yeah, after living in London for a very, very long time, my desire is to basically follow the Olympics from venue to venue. Though, unfortunately, I never managed to live in Paris or Rio or any other exciting place. But no, I managed by accident to have landed in another place that is hosting the Olympics. Brisbane, bizarrely, had more time than any other Olympic host to organise the Games. It was awarded the 2032 Games back in 2021, an unprecedented 11 years to get these games organised. So you may wonder why it took the first 4 years to actually come up with a concrete plan for what they are going to do with them.
Do we know what they're going to do with them?
Well, finally, yes, there's been all sorts of political debate about what to happen. We had a change of government in Queensland last year, and that meant another review of the Olympic plans. But we now have a firm plan for the Games. And at the centre of the argument, as you said in your introduction, was whether or not we would get a new Olympic stadium. And governments before have said that they could not justify the cost of constructing a huge new stadium when there are already a couple of big stadiums in Brisbane. But this review said that the stadiums we have were not big enough or good enough, and that there was now no longer the time to change them, to rebuild them or remodel them such that they will be suitable to stage the openings and closing ceremonies or the major athletics events. So the new government, the Liberal National Government under Premier David Crisafulli, who had actually ruled out building new stadiums in his election campaign, has now announced that it will build a new stadium. It'll be in Victoria Park, just north of the city centre. It'll have a capacity of about 63,000 spectators, and it will have future use. It will become the main venue for cricket and for AFL, for football here in Australia after the games. And so it will have a life afterwards. It's not to say it's not controversial. Not only is he going back on that previous election pledge to not build a stadium at great expense, but it is also going to involve tearing up a major park, which is much loved by many people in Brisbane. So that it is not uncontroversial. But what he said was, look, the previous government, he blamed the previous government, had, he said, wasted so much time prevaricating over what to do that we'd arrived at the point where you couldn't remodel the existing stadiums. The choice was humiliation on a global scale of a substandard Olympics and a substandard stadium, or biting the bullet, putting down the money now and actually committing to build a new stadium that would be fit for the purpose of a major global sporting event.
And this plays into this age-old debate that everybody has about hosting the Olympics, doesn't it? And we have heard complaints from London to Paris to Rio, everybody saying we don't want this and we don't need a new stadium. It is not going to rejuvenate a city until it actually happens. And then everybody falls head over heels in love with the thing.
Well, the Olympics doesn't tend to make a profit on itself, though Paris actually did manage a small surplus. But generally speaking, the games don't turn a profit. And the idea is you get all this attention, you get several weeks at the centre of global attention. The whole world has your name on its lips. They are obsessed with your city. And the people watching it think that looks like a good location for a holiday. That looks like a good place to visit. Other people may even think it looks like a good place to invest money or set up a business. Now, the argument has always been that the only cities that could afford to stage the Olympics were cities that were so large in scale that they probably didn't need that much advertising for their tourist economy. People are generally already thinking they might like to visit London or Paris or Sydney. And the International Olympic Committee knows this, which is why they have changed the plans to try to shrink it down a little, to try to make it more sustainable, in the hope that medium-sized cities like Brisbane, who perhaps arguably could benefit from that boost. Most people outside of the Asia-Pacific, if they think of Australia, they probably think of Sydney or Melbourne. They probably think less of Brisbane. So the idea was Brisbane would never have the opportunity to have so much attention over a concentrated period as it would do hosting the Olympics and Paralympics. But the problem with that is, you still have to spend the money. You still have to build the stadiums. You still have the many years of inconvenience. And you and I were both in London in the lead up to the 2012 Olympics there. We had the typical British approach that it would not work. It would be a disaster. The stadiums would not be built. The whole thing would be a humiliation. And then somehow, mystically, it all clicked into place in the last 6 months. And not only that, but the mood in the city changed. There is, like it or not, something about the Olympics. You realize that you can't screw it up. You have to get it right. And the attitude in London certainly changed around the Olympics. I have never recalled a London that was as cooperative and helpful and relatively cheerful as it was during the games. And I suppose the hope is that Brisbane, that is already a relatively smilier and happier place than London, will manage to pull it all together at the last minute, and that it will then accelerate their growth on the world stage, as well as leaving some decent infrastructure behind.
Paul, a very quick question about the crocodile-infested waters. They are going to row on this river which has saltwater crocodiles in it. We've had the Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, half joking, saying, well, that will break some records because people will go pretty quickly. And how serious a problem is this?
Well, potentially, obviously, you don't want rowers rowing in shark or crocodile-infested waters. Look, as with all of these games, there is that desire to not concentrate the economic benefit in one area. And so Queensland is very much a sort of state of two halves. You have southeast Queensland, Brisbane, the Golden Sunshine Coast. That's where sort of most of the population live. That's where most of the economic activity is. Then you have regional Queensland, a very different place, and often very jealous and angry about the southeast corner getting all the attention and getting all the money. So there was a conscious effort to do this, as you say, sailing at Townsville, rowing in Rockhampton. Let's not talk about the state of the waters. I'm sure there's a plan to do something about the dangerous creatures that are in there. And football and basketball in Cairns. To give you some indication, Cairns is as far away from Brisbane as Rome is from London. It is a very long way away from the official venue of the Olympics. But the regions are losing out too. There was going to be a new rail link up to the Sunshine Coast. That's had to be cut back. People will have to get on a bus this time in order to afford that stadium. So that whole city v country, capitals v regions debate is going to continue for the next 7 years. But you know what? They're not going to hand back the Olympics as Victoria handed back the Commonwealth Games. They're too deep into this now to go back. So however much it costs and however much internal political dissent there may be around it, they are going to have to find a way to pull this off by 2032.
Paul Osborne, thank you so much for joining us on the line from Brisbane. You're listening to The Globalist. Now, thanks to ample oil and gas reserves discovered in the late 60s, Norway leapfrogged from being a relatively modest economy to being one of the richest in the world, endowing its government with an enviable €1.7 trillion sovereign wealth fund, the biggest of its kind in the world. But the past decade or so has seen the Norwegian economy stagnate, and the population is starting to feel it. Well, economist and former head of McKinsey in Norway, Martin Beck-Holter, has controversially argued that it is precisely Norway's famed oil fund that is to blame for all the problems in what's become the country's most hotly debated book of the year, The Country That Became Too Rich. And Gunnar Grønlid heard from Holter and began by asking what's going on with the economy.
Norway is the most opportunity-rich country in the Western world, really, right? So, the previous generation has managed the petroleum wealth extraordinarily well. So it's like the country has been given a huge inheritance. So now it's the petroleum fund is $2,000 billion and divided by 5 million people. It's a big inheritance, right? But as with heritage generally and inheritance, it's a problem, right? It requires discipline to utilize inheritance in a good way. And the way we have managed it, the last decade has made the economy weaker. The inheritance and the petroleum money has been spent to make the society more passive, less active. It has all been spent on increasing public spending and in the process reducing the incentives in the economy, quite more broadly. And the outcome of that is that income for regular people has stagnated. So we've had a lost decade in terms of real wages, and by Norwegian standards, it's the worst decade in 60 years, or at least 55 years.
And that's very interesting because it's the story that we Norwegians tell ourselves, the way that, let's say, I was sort of brought up in school. The story that we're told about Norway is that it was basically a very poor country, and then we discovered oil, and then a very wise sort of state management of the money that came from that led to this incredible wealth. What do you think is actually wrong about that story?
This is also the story that we tell, at home, right? So in TV, on, TV shows, TV series, on, radio programs, this is the story that all Norwegians hear about, right? But if you just think about the hard facts, 90% of our net present income is from hard work on the mainland economy. 10% is basically the petroleum fund, right? And 90% of what we talk about is petroleum, and 10% is the mainland. and this book is about trying to help regular Norwegians appreciate that fact. And the reason why we became wealthy was that we managed the mainland economy extremely well, in addition to managing the petroleum fund.
You sort of identify this one very fundamental flaw, as you see it, in the petroleum fund, which you say was managed incredibly well, but that there was one flaw in how all of that was set up. Can you explain that?
With the petroleum wealth, there are kind of 4 layers in terms of managing it. Layer 1 is actually managing to set up a fund for the politicians to accept that, they're not free to spend the money on a running basis. So that's, layer 1, which they managed to do. Layer 2 is that it has been managed by the central bank, by a special unit set up by the central bank in an extremely cost-effective manner, with very little controversy, which is kind of layer 2. Layer 3 is that we have a rule for how much of the fund we're allowed to spend each year. So now, we are allowed to spend 3% of the fund every year. But layer 4 is, how should we spend it? And there are guidelines for how to do that, but no rules. And that means that the petroleum fund, it's now 20% of government budget. It has increased from basically 0 to 20% of the government budget over, say, a 15-year period. And that means that, the petroleum fund, the money we're allowed to spend is basically becomes part of the short-term politics. So instead of the guideline was that the money should be spent to invest in a strong mainland economy with, good incentives to work, save, and invest. And it's used basically to increase subsidies to businesses, to increase transfers to all types of organizations that represent, important voting groups, on extravagant public projects that are extremely expensive because there are no budget constraints. And that is what I call about, passivating instead of activating the population.
On a sort of positive note, funny enough, almost immediately after you published this book, in the book, like I mentioned earlier, you praise Jens Stoltenberg as having been one of these sort of day one leaders, as you call them, who make difficult choices that lead to growth and innovation and so forth. And now we've had this sort of lost decade of day two leaders. And then in a surprise move, Jens Stoltenberg returns as finance minister. Do you see this as a positive opportunity where these trends might actually shift and turn around?
Economic policy is a kind of outcome of the game between voters and politicians, right? And politicians, they offer policies that they believe will win them elections. So I've spoken to quite a few politicians. They are aware of all the challenges I talk about, but they find it very hard to fix it when they're going to propose economic policy for voters, because voters reward short-term policy. And then Jens Stoltenberg is back, which is it's probably the biggest opportunity to change this near term, because his understanding of economic policy is extraordinary. His standing in the Norwegian population is extraordinary. So if there's anyone who can, change the outcome of that play between politicians and voters, it will be him, right? But my project is also to, help voters be more aware of what will serve them long term, because this is, not easy, right? It's a hard topic, but there's huge interest in the Norwegian population to get a grip on this, right? Because they can feel it in their day-to-day life.
That was the economist Martin Beck-Holter speaking to Monocle's Gunnar Grunled. You're listening to The Globalist. Time to head to Tokyo to hear from our bureau chief and senior Asia editor Fiona Wilson, who joins us now from our Tokyo bureau. Also popping his head around the door is the head of radio, Tom Edwards. Good afternoon to you both.
Hi there. Good afternoon, Emma. How nice to be, where we are. It's a bit of a novelty for me. It's been such a long time, too long, Fiona, since I was last here in Tokyo.
I know, it's nice to have Tom back again. In fact, we realised that Tom hadn't been to the not-so-new office, so it's lovely for him to see the setup
10 years in.
It's good to have you both together in the same room. Fiona, before we get on to the main business that you wanted to talk to us about, we had some very sad news here at Monocle yesterday, the death of Gwen Robinson, a friend of yours and one of the instrumental voices on Monocle Radio.
Yeah, I mean, incredible friend to me personally, as long as I've been in Japan. She's been a great friend, many, many evenings spent with Gwen, hilarious outings. And anyone who knows her will know what I'm talking about. She was always up for a dinner, a drink and a good goss, as she always said. And yeah, she was a great friend to Monocle and an amazing correspondent. She was correspondent for The Times, The Financial Times, Nikkei Asia. She's been in Tokyo, Jakarta, Bangkok, Washington. She seemed to know everybody. And she was very useful. If I ever needed to find a contact, I thought, I'm just going to message Gwen and she will know someone who can help me. And she always did. Her voice will be very sadly missed here on Monocle Radio, at least. I think there'll be more fulsome tributes coming in the next few days. But let's just switch our attention to Japan now and it's having to look at its relationship with the United States, as is arguably everybody. Yeah, I mean, I think, as we're hearing constantly daily in the news, every country is having to see where they stand in relation to Donald Trump's administration. And I think Japan is no exception. Now, Japan and the US have a traditionally very close relationship. There's been a lot of concern with the talk about tariffs. And there have been some very uncomfortable noises in the last few weeks about Japan needs to pay more for defense. It should be spending 3% of its GDP on defense. It should be paying more to host US troops. There are 55,000 US military personnel in Japan. So these rather troubling noises. We've had Pete Hegseth here, the Secretary of State for Defence, last couple of days. He went to Iwo Jima on Saturday and he met with Gen Nakatani. There was a sort of parade for him, but with the Japan Self-Defense Forces. And the noises were quite positive, I have to say. There was no suggestion they didn't talk numbers. And actually, Pete Hegseth talked about Japan as a model ally, indispensable partner. He made all the right noises. And I think there will be a huge amount of relief in Tokyo this morning.
Let's move on to another story, which is quite astonishing, that Japanese imperial families to start a YouTube account. Is this a good thing?
I'm worried for them, frankly. Last year, they started an Instagram account. I was just looking through my fingers thinking, how is this going to end? This is going to be bad. The Japanese royal family is not the grooviest of royal families. They're not out in public meeting, glad-handing people. It's very much a sort of distant, respected institution. And that's how people seem to like it. They're still wearing gloves. They're doing all the very traditional kind of openings. And, they decided they needed to take control of their own narrative. I think everybody in public life is the target of, criticism on social media. And even the Japanese royal family was no exception. And I think they felt maybe we need to decide how our story is going to be told. So this Instagram account they set up now has nearly 2 million followers. I think they're quite surprised. The Imperial Household Agency is a very traditional establishment. So, I think this YouTube account will be interesting. I don't think we're going to expect very dynamic films coming out of them, let's be honest. It may be, recordings of buildings being opened and trees being planted, but that's all we want. I don't know.
Well, I was going to say, I've seen a few of the sort of previews of the types of things we may see, and there's a lot of sort of, kingfisher at rest on a branch and some blossoms and a few dignitaries standing somewhat formally. So I don't think it's going to be sort of, at home with the emperor. It's not going to be like Meghan Markle's programme, Emma, for better or worse.
They're not going to go full Kardashian on us, we're hoping.
I wish they would, but that's probably rather unlikely, Fiona.
No, I think so. I mean, they have to keep away from any hint of anything political, controversial. So I think, they will be sticking with the cherry blossoms and the kingfishers.
I just want to know more about the gloves. Fiona Wilson and Tom Edwards, thank you so much for joining us on the line from Tokyo. You're listening to The Globalist.
UBS has over 900 investment analysts from over 100 different countries.
Over 900 of the sharpest minds and freshest thinkers in the world of finance today.
To find out how we could help you,
contact us at ubs.com.
Time here in London is 7:53 a.m. Now, champagne can only be produced in the Champagne region. Strict rules govern this. But it appears we may have been getting this wrong, because in America, certain conditions allow for the sparkling wine we assume to be 100% French to be made in the USA. And with Donald Trump now threatening a 200% tariff on imports of champagne from France, how worried should the French be? Well, to tell us more, I'm joined in the studio by Oliver Haynes, journalist and the co-host of the FLEP24 podcast covering the French legislative elections. Good morning, Oliver.
Good morning. Great to be here.
Good to have you with you. You were in France last week. They mustn't be happy about this.
No, they're quite worried. So I went to Épernay because my girlfriend lives in Reims, which is like one of the main Champagne cities. But Épernay is the lovely town with the Champagne Avenue. And I spoke to a few of the smaller houses because the bigger houses are really worried. And so they're not talking to anyone currently. But the smaller houses are very concerned by Trump's proposals, particularly his use of the phrase American champagne businesses.
Because we're not allowed to... So just explain this, clarify for those of us who thought that only champagne could be the champagne that we all know and arguably love, that has to become from a specific part of France, specific grapes. The rules are pretty fixed on this. And now suddenly everyone's saying, actually, no, the Americans can do this too. Why is that?
Well, it's basically ignoring what's called the appellation, which is the kind of specific soil and rules around Champagne. This is not the first time that this has happened. So when I spoke to the producers, they said that they were worried that the situation in the US would become the way it has been in Russia, where Russian sparkling can be presented as champagne, and champagne from the Champagne region gets presented as French sparkling wine. So really it's kind of a question of labelling, partly because they blend wine as well. But in terms of the way the rest of the world works, it's simply, if it's from Champagne, it's champagne, and if it's from anywhere else, it's just sparkling. But, Trump's kind of got in on post-truth in other aspects of his politics. Why not for champagne as well?
How much are the champagne producers? You said that quite a lot of them are keeping things zipped. But the ones that you spoke to, and what are their genuine concerns about which markets might just find the idea of American champagne? That sounds so strange to say. Like the idea of American champagne as a bit of a novelty or, a new thing to discover?
I don't think it's so much that they're worried that America will be able to export champagne and call it champagne. I think what they are worried about is that America provides a huge market for export for champagne from France, and that is now going to be lost. So what a few of them said to me was that this is effectively the end of champagne for the American consumer. It's already quite expensive to buy champagne in America. There's markups before you get to the champagne cellars. There's an even greater markup before you get to restaurants. And if a bottle is going to be 300% of the original price, it is basically going to end the ability to drink proper champagne there. So I tried a champagne at the Maison Michel Gounet while I was there, which would cost $250 in America if they were to buy it now. But if the tariffs go ahead, will cost $1,000. And what they said is that American restaurants will just source other types of wine. They will just try and replace the imports with something else because it's going to be completely unfeasible.
Finally, briefly, Oliver, have you tasted American champagne?
I have not, no.
Right. So do we know what the difference is? Why it's so different?
Well, it's come from California mostly. And I think it's a different soil. I'm not an expert on... champagne tasting. I would too much of a Philistine. But having lived in the Champagne region, a few years ago and seen the pride with which everyone sort of believes in champagne and takes care of champagne from that region, I'd imagine they would be pretty horrified by the idea.
Oliver Haines, thank you so much for joining me in the studio. And that's all the time we have for today's programme. The warmest of thanks to all my guests and to our producers, Anita Riotta and Tom Webb. Our researcher was Francesca Gilks and our studio manager was Mariella Bevan. After the headlines, there's more music on the way. The briefing's live at midday here in London and The Globalist is back at the same time tomorrow. But for now, from me, Emma Nelson, goodbye. Thank you for listening. Have a great week.